Hey everybody, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. Whatever time you're watching this, wherever you are watching this, I hope that the season has gotten off to a great start for you. If you haven't competed yet, then this video will be of particular use to you. As a reminder, the topic is resolve the United States ought to guarantee the right to housing. To give you an idea of how this topic analysis will go, I'm going to go over it kind of in the way that I did when I wrote this topic analysis, expand on some things, go back over them, because I know that there are people that learn differently, whether it's through writing or listening or reading or whichever mode of learning works best for you. And so I hope that I'm able to provide you some value there. As we get into this, a couple of caveats. The first, if you are a novice, there's going to be about 20 minutes this video, and so pick the parts that are most useful to you. If you think that it's really challenging to listen to 20 minutes, I get it. Pick the arguments that you think have the most truth value, or where you think that you and your coaching staff can really succeed. So, without further ado, let's get into it. General thoughts on the topic. This topic is going to be decided by who wins the battle of topicality, as I'm going to call it. This can relate to things like framework and definitions, anything that allows you to draw a bright line that says on this side of the line it is topical, on this side of the line it is not. I think that is huge on this topic. I also think that this topic has a much easier path to the ballot for the affirmative. I'll get into why when I get to my affirmative section, but generally speaking, I think that the definitions and other things for the affirmative are much, much easier. That being said, I think that there exists ground on both sides, and that when in doubt, you should always pick where there is the most topic knowledge for you to use. I think this is particularly useful because in circuits where it's super traditional, the parents are going to want to vote for what sounds the best and what is the most true in the status quo. Because of that, I think you should go there, right? Follow the path of least resistance. Now, going on from that, couple of definitions. Housing, I think, can go in a couple of different ways. I have this housing and urban development definition that talks about no more than 30% of gross income for housing costs, including utilities. I think that on the affirmative, this gives you a lot of play because no more than 30% doesn't specifies per individual person, but if it's for a family, then you can guarantee housing to a home or to rent-controlled apartments, or to whichever avenue you want to go in. I also think this is especially beneficial just in general because it gives a very narrow scope of we are not saying that it is for free. We think that this is the bright line, and therefore this is the path forward, right? Whether it is that definition or another one, I think it is essential that you define what housing is. On the flip side, on the negative, there's this great definition from the UN that really puts a number of obligations on the affirmative. So from the framing perspective, if you are looking for a way to kind of shift the conversation around housing, go find the definition, use it. I think that is probably one of the single-handedly best definitions on the negative side. Yeah, like what is housing, right? I think there are a bunch of different definitions. They exist. Go find them. Please define it. Other than that, quick general thought, and this is more to the novices, but I want to stress this because I didn't get to expand on this quite as much as I wanted to in the written topic analysis. The word ought is super important when you go into the novice division. Ought means that in Lincoln Douglas, we consider the way that things should be, not the way that things will happen. This means that most procedural arguments that center around, oh, well, we can't do this because it wouldn't happen, are not valid from your opponent. I'm bringing this up because I think it's especially notable given that it's the first topic. And then in a novice division, you may have people that try to say that. And because it's housing, there are a bunch of regulations and other things to consider. So it's a very quick side note, but it's a very important one in the general thoughts section of, as we're defining the topic and what an affirmative ballot or negative ballot actually means, it's what should happen, not what would happen. So other than that, let's go ahead and pivot to the idea of zoning. For those of you that are unfamiliar, zoning has been a huge discussion in the country as a whole. With zoning, the way that Cornell defines it is, quote, a legislative act dividing a jurisdiction's land into sections and regulating different land uses in each section in accordance with a zoning ordinance. This means that there is land wherever you live, for the most part, that tells you where you can build things like schools, single-family homes, apartment complexes. All of those are divided out depending on where you live. In order to make sure that you're able to guarantee a right to housing, to everybody is included there, right? And as we talk about definitions of zoning, especially on the affirmative, there is this argument to be made kind of for redlining, where you had zoning laws that really didn't help minorities. And that under a minimizing structural violence framework, if we guarantee a right to housing for all, that is good quality housing, that is a huge deal. There are, and I'll talk about it more in the affirmative, but there are a lot of positive externalities there. And I think this is a big thing for you if you're going to use minimizing structural violence as your framework. Other than zoning, I think that we need to discuss what the idea of a guarantee actually meaningfully is. I've seen a variety of arguments that debate whether or not we can guarantee a right. This is something you need to be prepared for. So, in the context of a guarantee, I've done my best in the written topic analysis to give you a definitional example, and I'll expand on it here. First by reading the definition, then explaining why I think it's useful. So the definition that we have comes from the Melbourne Principles for Sustainable Cities, and they tell us that economic strategies should guarantee the right to potable water, clean air, food security, shelter, and safe sanitation. I think this is a critical definition because it tells you very clearly it's not just this idea of a guarantee you're kind of pulling out of thin air, but that tangible governments and tangible actors and entities have this definition. Therefore, it could be implemented in the US and applied to this situation. The fact that housing here includes things like safe sanitation and those kinds of things solves for the negative argument of, okay, you're going to give them housing, but is the housing adequate? Do they have access to water? Do they have access to the things that make the housing usable? And I think that this definition precludes a lot of those arguments and therefore is very useful. And other than that, right, it just explains what a guarantee is, and it can kind of give you a counter-inter if and when you get into what essentially becomes a rules debate over whether or not you can actually guarantee a right. I think that you should also have a definition for what a right is. I'm going to choose not to give a definition here because I think that what the definition of a right is very case dependent. But I think that it could be useful to have a definition for what a right is kind of off to the side. Because again, all of the topicality and definition debates that could occur, I think that having as many of these terms kind of defined in the back of your pocket as you can have is exponentially useful. So that was a lot on definitions and on framing in general. Let's move to the affirmative. With the affirmative, let's start with framework. So the first and most obvious framework is this idea of minimizing structural violence. There's this really interesting card about minimizing structural violence from Kathleen Ho that was written in 2007 that talks about how minimizing how structural violence constrains agency. And I think that can be particularly useful here on the affirmative, where you're arguing that without redress for adequate housing, or the lack thereof in this case, and that by voting affirmative you provide that you allow people to attain more jobs, that you have all these other positive externalities. I think that in addition to that, there's a lot of potential solvency. We live in an era of a pandemic. It is calmed down for the minute, but in high density areas with the unhoused, the spread of COVID-19 and therefore in addition, lack of PPE and the fact that it's going to spread more and potentially cause more fatalities is a huge deal. And I think that if you can prove some kind of solvency there, that is huge to be able to have kind of this very, very easy, tangible impact for your judge, if you will. I believe that finding impacts that have that kind of inherency in the status quo, that your judge, even if they're a parent, can sit there and go, yeah, you know what? That makes sense. I believe that. That is how, in a traditional setting, you win the debate, by finding impacts like that as it relates to minimizing structural violence. In addition, right, I think that there are all kinds of pieces of evidence that say that lifespans get extended. There is better attendance in schools, right? There's all of these, whether it's earning more because of the job or whatever it is, pick your positive externality, solving for the unhoused community and the unhoused family communities, which because of things like redlining, under minimizing structural violence, right, you are solving for those that are the unseen in society or the often underrepresented. Being able to solve for that is huge under minimizing structural violence. And I think that fundamentally, that is how that argument works in the scope of this topic. So that's a lot of minimizing structural violence. It's there. And I think that you would do well to use it in a traditional setting. Let's move on to the second framework idea, which is Rawls. For those of you that are not familiar with Rawls philosophy, I'm going to very quickly distill it down. Rawls cares about the perfect starting point. And so he believes that society should all start at a fair point. And in this particular instance, I'm going to key on something called the difference principle, which says that it's about going ahead and having the form of strict equality. Because of this, you loop housing in. And you link it into housing because the earning will be better, so the wealth of the economy goes up, the wealth of the least advantaged goes up the biggest percentage, therefore it works. Under the difference principle with Rawls, that's how you get there. Rawls says that you create the equal starting point for everybody in his idea of creating this equitable point zero, as I'm going to call it. When this happens, you can argue that it would always happen under Rawls because of what he describes as the egoism-altruism paradox. You can take 10 people from anywhere across the world, put them into a room, and have them design society. They're doing this with folders that don't have people's names on them. And as you design society, which include those 10 people in the room, either they design the best society because they're all egotistical and they don't want to put themselves at the lowest, or they're altruistic and they just want to make society good for everybody. This links into housing because if you can guarantee a right to housing for all, you fundamentally achieve a good starting point. You wipe away things like redlining. you solve for fundamentally all kinds of structural inequities. With this idea, I think that it's super, super, super persuasive to go with Rawls. In my written topic analysis, there is this idea of Kohlberg that I think can be justified. I have linked the article there, and I have some other pieces of evidence that I think will allow you to kind of help link into the topic and establish that framework. But again, I think on a framework level, very interesting. So moving away from that, let's go to specific case arguments. So in terms of those arguments, I think that there are a couple of things to expand upon that I didn't necessarily talk about initially. First, one of the biggest impactors of intergenerational wealth is owning a home. I think it's fair to say that guaranteeing a right to housing may not mean physically owning property, but that it allows a pathway to owning property. This means that things like debt tangibly go down, which means that there's then more agency, right? All of these positive knock-on effects kind of happen with each other. As a result of that, I think that on the affirmative, once you establish, whether it's through Rawls or through minimizing structural violence, that you are able to redress all of these harms that not guaranteeing housing or not having housing creates, that is your path to the ballot. I think that how you get there depends fundamentally on how do you define things, how do you explain things to the judge, and what is the depth of your topic knowledge. The gigantic overview to all these affirmative arguments is that I think that spending a large amount of time really kind of filling out the analysis on the impacts is going to be extremely beneficial here, because I think that the team that better understands the affirmative will be able to undermine a lot of the negative arguments with the positive externalities that are there. So that's the affirmative side, right? I think that it becomes an impact debate, if you will, after the idea of frameworks. Last argument that I'll mention, voting. I think this is going to be super undercovered, but the idea of, hey, if they're not housed, then how does that affect voting? And the idea that not on like the big national level with the presidents and the senators and House representatives, but the people that control the local positions, the inability to vote those people out creates all kinds of really interesting questions. And I think that if you can solve for that under housing, that is potentially a huge area for the app to really kind of blow up and exploit. So that's the affirmative. Let's go ahead and flip sides of the coin and go to the negative. I believe that the best argument here is some kind of capitalism K, or cap K for short. I think this is because you can say that even if we look to redress things, that we get back to the same point, because capitalism will inherently pollute the goodwill that the AF attempts to do, and that it's like super cruel what the affirmative is doing, because then you're just giving people false hope, right? The only redress is to completely redo the system. There's a lot of standard cap K literature. I think that you just kind of pick the length that you want here. I do also think that you can take the K and water it down for a more traditional style of debate. I think the way that you do this is you just establish the link where you can go, hey, what we should do is not give people the false hope that we're going to suddenly fix things. And that even if we assume fiat, right, and we do the affirmative, we still end up back in this place. Because even if we guarantee housing, they can't solve for this, and this that are wrong with the system. So I think that some kind of argument there is super, super, super persuasive if you are in any kind of circuit that is allowing some kind of progressive debate, that's my first avenue of attack, is under capitalism critique. Other than that, I think that you argue the idea, not that like you can't guarantee a right, but there's a super interesting loophole that I found in the idea that a guarantee for housing kind of already exists. So this is under Title 42 of the US Code, Section 5308, that says that the government can guarantee a loan. This can also be extrapolated to things like Section 8 housing already existing. And that even if the affirmative wants to expand things like Section 8, that it already exists in the status quo. And so the affirmative isn't making a change. The entire argument here is predicated on the impetus that the affirmative, when you vote affirmative, that you're making a change to the way that things exist, and that simply expanding already existing programs, whether it be things to guarantee loans like exist to teachers and veterans and those groups, or for Section 8 housing or those kinds of things, that is not guaranteeing a right to housing because it already exists. And that if the affirmative wants to win, that they need to show some kind of new solvency. They can't just simply expand on a new program. I think this is especially impactful when you look at the UN definition for housing, and you're able to kind of marry those two ideas together. On a traditional circuit, I think that this kind of argument is going to take a lot of time to explain, but I think that it makes the most sense as it relates to a very simple argument, if you will. I think it's also very persuasive to a lot of judges, where you can go, hey, the role of the affirmative is to make a change, and they're not making a change. For any of the parents, if they're lawyers, or if they've experienced whatever their life experiences are, and you're doing this at a CFL or whatever your local competition is, that's super persuasive to me as a layperson. Other than that, the overuse of eminent domain and displacing people that already are living there is a huge argument. The argument here premises on the fact that, hey, if we change zoning codes, that's cool, but you already end up in the same exact place because now you just destroyed a bunch of single family homes. You went ahead and took away a lot of existing infrastructure, and now they don't have housing either. And so how do you stop the infinite negative cycle of, like, you're going to build it out, but what happens in the interim? Where do they go for housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Therefore, too many bad things, can't affirm. I think this is super, super, super interesting because there are a lot of cases about eminent domain and what you can and can't use it for, or as far as zoning laws, what the implications of actually changing them are, right? I think that they are essentially the same thing here, and that kind of breaking those two things apart allows you to really, really, really tackle them separate issues, right? So what is eminent domain? Why can't we do it so much? What kind of negative feedback loop does that create? Okay, now I get into zoning, because if we're already claiming buildings, to demolish them and rebuild, in this case, the assumption being apartment buildings that or some kind of affordable housing, then we have to redo the zoning codes. And okay, we can now redo the zoning codes. We have the land for it, but what happens to everybody? Right? I think that argument is super persuasive on the lay level. Other than that, I think that you need to make an argument on grounds that you need to limit the affirmative's use of fiat as quickly as you can, right? I think that that fiat is a huge area of discussion here, where you can't simply create housing and ignore the negative side effects. I think that you argue that the exception to the general rule of fiat in debate here is that the negative effects can't simply be like thrown to the side, right? And I think that you need to win the fiat argument beforehand. On the negative side, there's also this politics DA that I've seen floating around. I am bringing this argument up because I think that it could be interesting for you to use. If you are not in a progressive circuit, I would advise you against running the DA, which I will let you go and find. But suffice to say, I think that there are better arguments that I've previously discussed other than the politics DA. I'm simply bringing it up here to make you aware of the arguments that exist in the resolution, as we call it. Other than that, I think that you can kind of pick your topicality argument. I explain this in terms of the rest of our negative position in the topic analysis, but to conclude, I will say the following. I think that with all the arguments that I've given you, both in the affirmative and the negative, it really, really, really simply just boils down to, hey, can you make an argument that makes sense? And can you be knowledgeable enough on the argument to defend it? After I'm making this topic analysis, this topic will continue to evolve. And as it continues to evolve, it's important to understand what is the new literature, because the topics meaning contentions will kind of stay the same, but what is the new literature? What are the issues with it? What are the really good pieces of evidence? What do they actually say? From a topic analysis standpoint, I think this is fundamental for me to mention whether you're a varsity or novice debater. Because it's not simply as I'm giving you these positions, but it's also that you take them and adapt them to the way that makes sense to you and that you own them. And that is my word of caution here, is I genuinely hope that everything that I have said here is of extreme use to everybody, but that you need to own the position and make it your own and develop your own story. In other words, whether you are on the affirmative or whether you are on the negative, when that debate finishes, about 45 minutes from the start, how do you get to the same end game? I mentioned this specifically because it's the first topic of the year. And whether you're varsity and you're a little bit rusty because it's the start of the year, or you're a novice and this is your first topic, understand with all the arguments today that you've heard and all the arguments that I'm sure that your coaching staff has passed along to you, if you can understand how to win and the intricacies of the arguments that I brought up today, you will win rounds. I hope that each and every single one of you has an awesome time during this topic. And other than that, have an amazing rest of your day.